The mining ship Terra's Pride shuddered as another blast rocked its hull. Captain Sarah Chen gripped her command chair, watching the main screen show 3 massive vessels closing in fast. These weren't like any ships she'd seen before. They looked organic, almost alive, with scales that glinted in the starlight. "Ma'am, they're not responding to any of our communication attempts," reported Lieutenant Torres from the communications station. His voice carried the edge of fear that everyone felt but tried to hide. Sarah's crew of 12 had been mining asteroids in the outer rim of the Kepler system when these strange ships appeared. The aliens hadn't tried to talk. They'd simply started firing some kind of energy weapon that made their shields spark and fail. "Engineering, how much power do we have left?" Sarah called out. 30%, and dropping fast," came the reply from Chief Engineer Kowski. "These weapons are draining our systems somehow. It's like they're feeding on our energy." The alien ships were beautiful in a terrifying way. Each one was roughly the size of a small moon, covered in what looked like metallic scales that shifted color from deep purple to bright gold. Long, wing-like appendages stretched from their sides, and at the front of each ship was something that looked remarkably like a dragon's head, complete with glowing eyes. "They're hurting us," realized Navigator Singh, studying his instruments. "Look at their formation. They're not trying to destroy us. They're pushing us toward that asteroid field." Sarah looked where he pointed and felt her blood run cold. Hidden among the asteroids was a structure so massive it defied belief. It looked like a gigantic cave carved from black stone, but it was clearly artificial. Strange lights pulsed along its surface, and the opening was easily large enough to swallow their mining ship whole. "Full reverse engines," Sarah ordered. "We're not going in there." "No good, Captain," reported the pilot. "Something's got us in a tractor beam. We can't break free." The Terra's Pride was pulled inexorably toward the dark opening. As they got closer, the crew could see that the structure was even more incredible than they'd first thought. The walls were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to move in the shifting light. Strange symbols that hurt to look at directly covered every surface. "Captain, I'm picking up massive energy readings from inside that thing," Torres said, his instruments beeping frantically. "There's something alive in there, something big." The ship passed through the opening, and immediately the main screen was filled with impossible sights. They were inside what could only be described as a technological dragon's lair. The ceiling stretched up so high it disappeared into shadows, supported by pillars that looked like giant bones. Everywhere they looked, there were treasures. Not gold and jewels like in old fairy tales, but technology beyond anything humanity had ever imagined. Ships from dozens of different species hung suspended in the air, held by the same energy that now gripped the Terra's Pride. Some of the vessels were familiar. Sarah recognized a Zephyrian cruiser and what looked like a Mantis exploration ship. Others were completely alien, their designs so strange they made her eyes water to look at them. "My God," whispered Dr. Martinez, the team's xenobiologist. "This isn't just a ship graveyard. It's a collection. Someone's been gathering vessels from across the galaxy." At the center of it all was a platform that seemed to be made of living crystal. On it sat something that took their breath away. A creature that was clearly the source of the dragon ships outside. It was enormous, easily the size of a city block, with scales that shifted through every color imaginable. Its eyes were like stars, ancient and knowing, and when it looked at their small mining ship, Sarah felt as if it was seeing into her very soul. The creature spoke, and somehow its voice filled their ship without using any communication system they recognized. The words formed directly in their minds, carrying weight and power that made the air itself seem heavier. "Welcome, little humans, to my domain. I am Paraxis the Eternal, collector of worlds, guardian of knowledge. Your species is interesting. Most who enter my realm come seeking conquest or treasure. You come seeking rocks." Sarah found her voice, though it took tremendous effort. "We're just miners. We didn't know this was anyone's territory. We'll leave if you let us." The ancient dragon's laugh rumbled through the chamber, making the suspended ships sway gently. "Leave? Oh, small captain, no one leaves my collection. But perhaps we can discuss terms. Your species intrigues me. In 3,000 years of collecting, I have never encountered beings quite like humans. What do you want from us? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. I want to understand what makes you special. Other species, when faced with impossible odds, surrender or fight uselessly until they die. But humans do something different. Something that has kept your species alive when it should have gone extinct a dozen times over. The dragon's massive head tilted, studying them like specimens under a microscope. I have been watching your species for some time. The way you turned a nuclear disaster into a source of power. How you survived ice ages that killed most life on your world. The way you looked at a vast, empty universe and decided to fill it with your presence. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This creature had been watching Earth, watching humanity. How long have you been observing us? Since your ancestors first looked up at the stars and decided they wanted to touch them. Most species develop spaceflight out of necessity, overpopulation, dying worlds, the need for resources. Humans developed it because you were curious, because you wanted to see what was out there. The dragon rose from its crystal platform, its massive form casting shadows that seemed to move independently. But curiosity alone would not have brought you this far. No, there is something else. Something that makes you dangerous to the established order of this galaxy. Around them, the collected ships seemed to pulse with their own inner light, as if responding to their captor's words. Sarah noticed movement in several of the vessels, other captives, watching this conversation with the same mixture of fear and fascination she felt. I will give you a chance, Captain Chen. A test, if you will. Succeed, and I will not only free your crew, but share with you knowledge that could advance your species by thousands of years. Fail. The dragon's smile revealed teeth like crystalline daggers. Well, failure will simply add your ship to my collection. Sarah looked at her crew, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had driven humanity to reach for the stars in the first place. They were trapped, outgunned, and facing something beyond their understanding. By all rights, they should surrender or despair. Instead, she felt that peculiarly human spark of defiance kindle in her chest. What's the test? The dragon's ancient eyes gleamed with something that might have been approval. Ah, there it is. That refusal to accept the impossible. Very well, little captain. Your test begins now. The ancient dragon Paraxis gestured with one massive claw, and the space around the Terra's pride began to change. The other captured ships faded from view, replaced by what looked like a vast arena made of the same living crystal as the dragon's platform. The walls pulsed with energy, and strange symbols appeared and disappeared in patterns that seemed almost familiar. Your test is simple in concept, complex in execution, Pyraxis rumbled, his voice filling their minds. For countless eons I have collected the greatest treasures of 1,000 civilizations. Ships, weapons, knowledge, art, all of it sits in my domain, protected and preserved. But there is one treasure that has eluded me. Sarah watched as images began forming in the air around them. Holographic displays showing battles across the galaxy. Species rising and falling, empires crumbling to dust. What treasure could you possibly not have acquired? The dragon's laugh was like thunder. The one thing that cannot be taken by force, bought with wealth, or stolen in the night. The one thing that must be freely given or it becomes worthless. The images shifted, now showing acts of incredible bravery, individuals sacrificing themselves for others, standing against impossible odds, choosing hope over despair. I seek to understand the true nature of courage. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her scientific mind engaged despite their dire situation. You want to study courage? That's what this is about? Not study, little scientist. I want to possess it. For 3,000 years I have watched species exhibit what they call courage, only to discover it was desperation, foolishness, or mere chemical reactions in their brains. But humans, the dragon's eyes fixed on each crew member in turn, humans show something different. The crystal arena around them began to shift, forming a complex maze of corridors, chambers, and obstacles. Some sections glowed with gentle light, while others were shrouded in darkness that seemed to absorb all illumination. Sarah could see movement in the shadows, things that weren't quite visible but definitely weren't friendly. Your test is this. Navigate my labyrinth and reach the center. There you will find a simple choice. Take a treasure beyond imagining for your species, or save the lives of others who have failed this test before you. Choose the treasure, and I will free you with wealth beyond measure. Choose the others. The dragon smiled, showing those crystal teeth again. Well, we shall see what that choice reveals. Lieutenant Torres swallowed hard. What happens if we just refuse to play your game? Then you join my collection immediately, and your species remains forever unknown to me. But I do not think you will refuse. Humans never refuse a challenge, even when they should. Sarah felt the familiar weight of command settle on her shoulders. Her crew was looking to her for guidance, but she also felt something else. That spark of human stubbornness that had driven her species to survive everything the universe had thrown at them. We'll do it, she said firmly. But we do it together. My whole crew. Paraxis tilted his massive head, studying her. Interesting. Most species select their strongest or most expendable members for such tests. You choose unity over efficiency. That's because you don't understand humans as well as you think, Sarah replied. We're stronger together than apart. The dragon waved a claw, and suddenly the crew of the Terra's Pride found themselves standing in the crystal maze, their ship nowhere to be seen. They were still in their normal clothes, but each person now carried a small device that glowed with soft blue light. Those will protect you from the more dangerous inhabitants of my labyrinth. Paraxis's voice echoed around them. But they have limited power. Use them wisely. Sarah looked around at her 12 crew members, seeing determination mixed with fear on their faces. Chief Engineer Kowski cracked his knuckles. Well, Captain, looks like we're doing this the hard way. When do we ever do anything the easy way? Replied Navigator Singh with a grim smile. The maze stretched out before them, with walls that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Sarah could hear sounds echoing from the depths, some mechanical, others definitely organic, all of them unsettling. But her crew gathered around her, ready to face whatever came next. All right, people, Sarah said, falling into the familiar rhythm of command. Singh, you're on navigation. Try to map this place as we go. Martinez, keep an eye out for any biological hazards. Torres, see if you can get any readings on what's ahead of us. As they moved deeper into the maze, they encountered the first challenge, a corridor that split into 5 different paths, each one disappearing into darkness. Above each path was a symbol that seemed to shift and change when they looked directly at it. I'm getting energy readings from all 5 paths, Torres reported. But 3 of them also show life signs, big ones. Dr. Martinez studied the symbols, her xenobiology training kicking in. These aren't random. They're some kind of test themselves. Look at the patterns. This one represents sacrifice. This one shows strength. This one... She paused, studying the 3rd symbol. I think this one represents hope, and the other 2? Sarah asked. Knowledge, and I'm not sure about the last one. It keeps changing. Sarah made the decision with the quick certainty that had made her a good captain. We take the path of hope. Whatever Paraxis is looking for in humans, hope has always been at the center of it. They entered the corridor, and immediately the walls began showing images, scenes from Earth's history but not the usual ones found in textbooks. These showed ordinary people making extraordinary choices, a teacher staying behind to help, students escape a natural disaster, scientists working around the clock to cure diseases they knew they'd never see ended in their lifetime, farmers sharing their last reserves of food with starving neighbors. He's been watching us for a long time, whispered Chief Medical Officer Park. These aren't just random moments. These are defining moments for our species. The corridor opened into a vast chamber filled with floating platforms connected by energy bridges. On some platforms, they could see figures, clearly the remains of other crews who had attempted this test. But they weren't dead. They were frozen in some kind of stasis, their faces showing expressions of terror, confusion, or resigned acceptance. The previous test takers, Sarah realized, they're still alive. At the center of the chamber was a pedestal holding two objects. One was clearly a piece of technology, a small device that pulsed with incredible energy. Even from a distance, they could sense its power. The other was a simple key made of the same crystal as the maze walls. Pyraxis's voice boomed through the chamber. "Choose wisely, Captain Chen. The device contains the complete technological knowledge of 17 advanced civilizations. With it, humanity could become the dominant force in this galaxy within a century. The key will free all those who came before you, but you will leave here with nothing but their gratitude." Sarah looked at her crew, seeing the weight of the decision reflected in their eyes. The technology could solve every problem humanity faced: energy, disease, even death itself. But those frozen figures on the platforms had families, crews, species that thought they were dead. Lieutenant Torres stepped forward. "Captain, that technology could save billions of human lives." Chief Engineer Kowski nodded toward the frozen figures. "But these people are somebody's friends, somebody's family. They're alive and trapped." Sarah felt the familiar burn of a truly impossible decision. This was what command really meant. Not just giving orders, but carrying the weight of choices that would define not just her crew, but her entire species. The dragon watched from above, his ancient eyes gleaming with interest. "What will it be, little captain? Your species' future or strangers you've never met?" Sarah stood before the two objects, feeling the weight of not just her crew's eyes on her, but somehow the gaze of her entire species. The device hummed with power that could transform humanity overnight. The key seemed almost pathetically simple, in comparison. She closed her eyes and thought about what had brought humans this far into space. It wasn't superior technology. Dozens of species had developed faster than light travel centuries before humanity. It wasn't greater physical strength or intellect. The galaxy was full of beings that surpassed humans in both areas. It was something simpler and more powerful than either. "Dr. Martinez," Sarah said suddenly, her eyes still closed. "In all, your studies of human behavior, what's the one thing that distinguishes us from other species you've encountered?" The xenobiologist looked puzzled by the question in such a crucial moment, but she answered thoughtfully. "We're one of the only species that consistently risks individual survival for abstract concepts. Most intelligent life forms are pragmatic. They preserve themselves and their immediate genetic group. Humans will die for ideas." Sarah opened her eyes and looked directly up at the dragon watching them. "Pyraxis, you said you've been studying courage for 3,000 years. But you're looking at it wrong." The ancient creature's head tilted, genuinely curious. "Explain." "You think courage is about making the smart choice under pressure. But real courage, human courage, is about making the right choice even when it's stupid." Sarah stepped toward the key. "Especially when it's stupid." "Captain, wait," Torres called out urgently. "That technology could prevent wars, cure diseases, give us unlimited clean energy. Think about how many human lives it could save." Sarah turned to face her crew, and they saw something in her expression they'd never seen before, a kind of certainty that went beyond rational calculation. "And how many lives will we lose along the way? How many compromises will we make? How many people will we decide aren't worth saving because the math doesn't work out?" Chief Engineer Kowski frowned. "That's not fair, Captain. We can be better than that." "Can we?" Sarah asked. "Look around this chamber. Every one of these frozen beings represents a species that thought they could handle ultimate power responsibly. Where are their civilizations now?" She gestured to the floating platforms. "That's a Zephyrian captain over there. Their species had technology that let them manipulate gravity itself. They used it to strip mine entire systems until they destroyed their own ecosystem. That crystalline being on the far platform? Her people developed the ability to transfer consciousness between bodies. They became so obsessed with individual immortality that they stopped reproducing and went extinct." Dr. Martinez was studying the frozen figures with new interest. "You're saying the technology corrupted them?" "I'm saying the technology gave them the power to stop being who they were," Sarah replied. "And once you stop being who you are, what's the point of survival?" Pyraxis spoke, his voice carrying a new note of interest. You would truly choose to save strangers over advancing your own species? Sarah picked up the key, feeling its surprising warmth. I'm choosing to stay human. The dragon's laugh echoed through the chamber, but it wasn't mocking this time. It was genuinely delighted. Fascinating. In 3,000 years, only 17 captains have chosen the key. Most of those did it because they calculated it would impress me more than taking the technology. And the others? The others were human. Sarah inserted the key into a hidden slot in the pedestal, and immediately the chamber filled with light. The stasis fields around the frozen beings began to dissolve, and one by one, they began to stir. The first to fully awaken was indeed the Zephyrian captain Sarah had pointed out, a tall, graceful being with skin like polished metal. The Zephyrian looked around in confusion, then focused on Sarah. How long? She asked in heavily accented standard. We don't know, Sarah replied honestly. But you're free now. More beings began to wake. The crystalline entity, a group of what looked like living plants, several species Sarah didn't recognize, and surprisingly, 2 other human crews. As they regained consciousness, they all turned to look at Sarah with the same expression of amazement. One of the human captains, a weathered man with lieutenant's stripes, approached Sarah. You chose the key? Over all that technology? Someone had to. The man shook his head in wonder. My name's Jackson, Captain Tom Jackson of the merchant vessel Lucky Strike. I've been here for, God, it must be 15 years now. I watched 47 different crews make that choice. Only 4 ever picked the key. All human? Sarah asked. All human, Jackson confirmed. And now I understand why that dragon kept us conscious during our stasis. He wanted us to see this moment. Paraxis descended into the chamber, his massive form somehow fitting into the space without crowding anyone. Up close, Sarah could see that his scales weren't just changing color. They were covered in tiny inscriptions, millions of them, in hundreds of different languages. You see truly, Captain Jackson, the dragon said. I wanted witnesses to what I have discovered. For 3 millennia, I have collected the greatest treasures of the galaxy, seeking to understand what makes intelligence special. I thought it was knowledge or power, or the ability to create beautiful things. The dragon's ancient eyes focused on Sarah. But now I understand. The greatest treasure isn't something that can be possessed. It's something that can only be demonstrated. The chamber began to change around them, the walls becoming transparent. Beyond the crystal, Sarah could see the vast collection of ships stretching out in all directions. Thousands of vessels from hundreds of different species. I am releasing them all, Paraxis announced. Every ship, every crew, every treasure, I have hoarded. They are free to leave. The freed captains looked at each other in amazement. The Zephyrian captain stepped forward. Why? You could have simply released us and kept the others. Because Captain Chen has shown me something I had forgotten in my long existence. True treasure is not diminished by sharing, it grows. Knowledge hoarded becomes stagnant. Power concentrated becomes corruption, but courage shared. The dragon's smile was different now, warmer somehow. Courage shared becomes hope. Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and anticlimax. So that's it? We just leave? Oh no, little captain, Paraxis said, and for a moment Sarah's heart stopped. Your real test is just beginning. The dragon gestured, and suddenly Sarah could see beyond the chamber, beyond even the massive structure they were in. Space around them was filled with ships, not the collected vessels being released, but new ones. Hundreds of them, from species she recognized and many she didn't. Word has spread through the galaxy about what you did here today, Pyraxis explained. Species that have never cooperated before are working together to come see the humans who chose compassion over power. Some come as friends, others. The dragon's expression darkened. Others come as threats. They cannot allow the example you've set to spread. Sarah looked at her small mining crew, then at the other freed captains, then at the approaching fleet. By all logic, they were about to face impossible odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and far from any help. She should have been terrified. Instead, she found herself smiling. "All right, people," she said, falling back into that familiar command rhythm. "Looks like we've got work to do." The approaching fleet was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Ships of every conceivable design floated in the void around Paraxis's domain, some sleek and elegant, others bristling with weapons, and a few so alien that looking at them too, Long made her eyes water. "I count over 300 vessels," reported Lieutenant Torres, somehow managing to get readings even in this strange crystalline space. "Maybe half are showing friendly signals. The other half—" He paused, checking his instruments again. "The other half are powering weapons." Captain Jackson of the Lucky Strike moved to stand beside Sarah. "In my 15 years of captivity, I heard a lot of Paraxis's visitors talking. Word travels fast in this galaxy, especially about humans. We've made some people very nervous." Martinez was studying the approaching ships with fascination rather than fear. It makes sense from a political standpoint. If word spreads that humans consistently choose principle over power, it undermines the authority of every empire built on the idea that might makes right. The Zephyrian captain, who had introduced herself as Commander Veltar, approached their small group. "My people have a saying, the wind that brings change is feared by those who profit from stillness. Your choice in that chamber has created ripples across the galaxy." Paraxis's voice rumbled through the space around them. "Indeed. I have already received communications from several major powers. The hegemony of claws wants you destroyed before your infection of weakness spreads. The Trade Federation offers to purchase exclusive rights to study your species, and the Eternal Empire suggests I preserve you in stasis as living examples of an interesting but ultimately flawed evolutionary branch." Sarah felt that familiar burn of anger that had driven humanity to survive every extinction-level event thrown at them. "Let me guess. None of them bothered to ask what we want? You are a small species from a backwater world with limited military power," Paraxis observed. "Most galactic powers do not ask such questions of those they consider insignificant." The Yao dragon's massive form began to glow with inner light. "However, I have made a decision that may interest you. For 3,000 years I have remained neutral in galactic politics, collecting treasures and observing the rise and fall of civilizations. Today, that neutrality ends." The space around them shifted, and suddenly Sarah and her crew found themselves back aboard the Terra's Pride, along with all the other freed captains and their crews. But their ship was no longer alone. It was surrounded by a protective formation of vessels that defied easy description. "My personal fleet," Paraxis explained, his voice now coming through their communication systems. "Ships built from the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 civilizations, crewed by beings who chose to serve knowledge over power. They are yours to command, Captain Chen." Sarah stared at the tactical display showing dozens of advanced vessels taking defensive positions around them. "I can't command your fleet. I'm just a mining captain." "You are the person who chose to free strangers rather than empower herself," Paraxis replied. "In my long experience, that is exactly the kind of person who should command fleets, Commander." Veltar's voice came through the communication channel. "Captain Chen, I pledge my ship and crew to your service. Not because of any debt, but because your choice showed me something I had forgotten. That honor is not a luxury for the safe and powerful, but a necessity for those who would remain worthy of freedom." One by one, other voices joined in. The crystalline entity, the plant beings dozens of species Sarah had never heard of, each pledging their ships and crews to follow her lead. "This is insane," Sarah muttered. "Yesterday I was worried about meeting our ore quotas, and now I'm supposed to lead some kind of galactic alliance." Chief Engineer Kowski chuckled. "Ma'am, if it helps, the engineering problems are about the same. Figure out what's broken, and fix it before everything explodes." The first test of their new alliance came quickly. A squadron of hegemony of Claws warships broke from the approaching fleet and began advancing with weapons hot. Sarah found herself making split-second decisions about the disposition of forces she barely understood, trusting in the expertise of beings she'd met less than an hour ago. "Veltar, can your gravity manipulators create a defensive barrier?" Already working on it, Captain. Jackson, your merchant skills. Can you identify which of these approaching ships might be swayed to our side? The Federated Clan's ships look nervous. They're following the hegemony's lead, but they're not committed. If we show strength without aggression, they might switch sides. Sarah felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders again. But this time it was different. Instead of just her 12-person crew depending on her decisions, she was responsible for hundreds of beings and dozens of species. The hegemony ships opened fire, sending streams of plasma toward their formation. But instead of meeting the attack, with overwhelming force, Sarah made a different choice. All ships, defensive positions only. Do not return fire unless I give the order. Captain, Torres called out urgently. Their weapons are breaking through Veltar's gravity barriers. We need to respond. Not yet, Sarah said firmly. She opened a communication channel to the attacking ships. Hegemony vessels, this is Captain Sarah Chen of the Terran vessel Terra's Pride. We are not your enemies. Stand down and let's talk. The response came back immediately, harsh and guttural in the hegemony's native language, but the universal translator made the meaning clear. Humans are a disease that must be cleansed before it spreads. Surrender now for quick death. Sarah sighed. Well, I tried diplomacy. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Instead of the usual pattern of fleets trying to destroy each other completely, Sarah's forces fought with surgical precision. They disabled weapons rather than destroying ships. They rescued ejected crew members from both sides. When hegemony vessels were crippled, they were offered medical assistance. The watching neutral ships began to murmur among themselves. This wasn't how galactic warfare was supposed to work. The hegemony commander, a massive reptilian being known as War Chief Scarex, demanded a direct communication link with Sarah. His image appeared on their main screen, all fangs and barely contained rage. What game do you play, human? You could have destroyed my flagship, but instead you disabled our weapons and then sent medical supplies. This makes no sense. Sarah looked directly into his alien eyes. War Chief Scarex, I have a question for you. How many of your warriors have died in glorious battle? The alien warrior seemed taken aback by the question. Thousands. It is the way of strength. And how many of them got to see their children grow up? Scarex was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. What is your point, human? My point is that there's more than one kind of strength. The strength to destroy is common in the galaxy. The strength to build, to protect, to choose mercy when you could choose vengeance, that's rarer. The war chief studied her through the communication link. You defeated my ships without destroying them. You rescued my warriors when you could have left them to die. This is unprecedented. It's Tuesday for humans, Sarah replied with a slight smile. Around them, the neutral ships began broadcasting messages. Some were pledging support for this new approach to galactic relations. Others were demanding to know if humans were available as mediators for ongoing conflicts. Still others were asking if Earth was accepting diplomatic envoys. Paraxis's voice came through their communications, and Sarah could hear the ancient amusement in his tone. Captain Chen, I believe you have just accidentally founded the first galactic alliance based on voluntary cooperation rather than conquest or mutual fear. Sarah looked at her tactical display, now showing dozens of species working together in ways that had never happened before in recorded history. Ships that had been enemies for centuries were coordinating rescue efforts. Former pirates were sharing medical supplies with Trade Federation vessels. What have we gotten ourselves into? She asked quietly. Dr. Martinez answered from her station, her voice filled with wonder. I think we've gotten ourselves into the future. 3 days after the battle that wasn't quite a battle, Sarah found herself aboard Paraxis's flagship, the Eternal Wisdom, participating in what could only be described as the galaxy's most unusual diplomatic conference. Representatives from 47 different species sat around a crystalline table that somehow accommodated beings ranging from gas cloud entities to rock-based life forms. The atmosphere was electric with possibility and tension. Species that had been enemies for millennia were actually talking to each other instead of shooting. But Sarah could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching their every move. The Eternal Empire is not pleased, announced Ambassador HFY, a tall, ethereal being whose species had dominated galactic politics for over 1,000 years. This alliance you've created threatens the stability we have maintained for centuries. Commander Veltar's metallic skin shifted to a deeper shade of silver, a sign of anger in her species. Stability built on the subjugation of weaker civilizations is not stability, it's tyranny with better marketing. War Chief Scarex, who had surprised everyone by requesting to join the alliance after their encounter, growled agreement. The Empire speaks of stability while my people were forced to become raiders just to survive their economic policies. Sarah had been mostly listening to the debates, learning about galactic politics that humanity had been blissfully unaware, but now she felt compelled to speak. Ambassador HFY, can I ask you something? The Imperial representative turned his ancient eyes toward her. You may ask, though I make no promise to answer. In all your centuries of stability, how many species have gone extinct? How many civilizations have fallen? How many beings have died in wars fought to maintain your established order? The ambassador was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ages. Such things are regrettable but necessary. The alternative to our order is chaos. Is it? Sarah asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the alternative to your order is choice. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her scientific mind engaged. We've been analyzing the galactic historical records that Paraxis shared with us. In the past 1,000 years under Imperial stability, 17 species have been classified as extinct, 43 have been reduced to client states, and there have been over 200 police actions to maintain order. And in the 3 days since this alliance formed, added Captain Jackson, we've mediated the end of 3 separate conflicts, established trade agreements between former enemies, and not a single being has died in violence. The ambassador's expression grew cold. 3 days is not 3 centuries, human. Your naive idealism will crumble when faced with real challenges. Before Sarah could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Pyraxis's voice filled the conference chamber with urgent authority. Imperial fleet detected. Over 500 vessels approaching at maximum speed. This is not a diplomatic mission. The representatives around the table exchanged glances. Some looked terrified, others resigned. But Sarah noticed something else. Determination. These beings had tasted something in the past few days that they hadn't experienced before. Hope. How long do we have? Sarah asked. 18 hours until they reach weapons range, Pyraxis replied. Their fleet includes 3 star destroyers and a void render. Captain Chen, this is not a force meant to negotiate. This is a force meant to eliminate threats to Imperial authority. Ambassador HFY stood slowly. I must contact my government immediately. Perhaps there is still time to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. War Chief Scarex's laugh was bitter. Your government sent that fleet, Ambassador. They have already decided. That bloodshed is not only necessary but preferred. Sarah felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions settling on her shoulders again. The alliance they'd built was fragile, held together more by hope than by any formal structure. Most of their ships were civilian vessels, mining ships, and traders, not military craft designed for battle against the Empire's finest. Paraxis, what are our realistic chances in a straight fight? The ancient dragon's response was characteristically blunt. If you fight the Empire the way they expect to be fought, you will lose completely. Their fleet is designed to crush rebellions through overwhelming force. And if we don't fight the way they expect, then you might surprise them long enough to survive. But survival is not victory, Captain Chen. Sarah looked around the table at the faces, alien and human alike, all watching her for some sign of what came next. 3 days ago, she'd been a mining captain worried about ore quotas. Now she was somehow expected to find a way to stand against the most powerful military force in the galaxy. She thought about her choice in Paraxis's maze, about choosing compassion over power. That choice had led to this moment where the galaxy's most powerful empire was mobilizing to destroy them simply for daring to suggest there might be a better way. All right, Sarah said, standing up. Here's what we're going to do. The next 18 hours were a blur of preparation unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of fortifying defensive positions or planning attack strategies, the Alliance did something completely unprecedented. They invited the Empire to a party. Using Pyraxis's vast communication network, they broadcast across the galaxy. Not a military challenge or a diplomatic protest, but an invitation. They invited every being in the Empire to witness what they called the demonstration. "You're insane," Commander Veltar said, but she was smiling as she said it. Inviting civilians to watch a battle is against every rule of galactic warfare. Good thing we're not planning to fight a galactic war, Sarah replied. When the Imperial fleet arrived, they found something that defied all their tactical planning. Instead of a defensive formation, the Alliance ships were arranged in a perfect sphere around Pyraxis's station. Instead of weapons powered and shields raised, they were broadcasting on every frequency: music, poetry, mathematical proofs, philosophical discussions, and simple conversations between crew members of different species. Admiral Korath, commander of the Imperial fleet, demanded immediate communication with the Alliance leadership. His image appeared on screens throughout the Alliance, a stern figure in elaborate military regalia. "I am Admiral Korath of the Eternal Empire. You will surrender immediately or face complete annihilation. You have 60 seconds to comply." Sarah appeared on the main communication channel, but she wasn't alone. Representatives from every species in the Alliance stood with her. The strange collection of beings that had somehow become the closest thing to family she'd ever known. "Admiral Korath, I'm Captain Sarah Chen. We're not going to surrender, and we're not going to fight you." The Admiral's expression showed confusion and anger. "Then what exactly do you intend to do?" "We're going to show the galaxy what we've learned," Sarah replied. "Pyraxis, initiate the demonstration." What happened next broke every rule of space warfare ever written. Instead of weapons, the Alliance ships began projecting holographic displays showing the past 3 days. Beings throughout the galaxy watched as former enemies worked together, as conflicts were resolved through conversation rather than violence, as species that had never cooperated found common ground. But more than that, they showed the personal moments. Hegemony warriors playing games with plant-being children, Trade Federation merchants sharing meals with former pirates, scientists from dozen species collaborating on projects that could benefit everyone. The Imperial fleet found itself surrounded not by enemy ships, but by the largest peaceful gathering in galactic history. Civilian vessels from across the Empire had responded to the invitation, wanting to see this impossible alliance for themselves. Admiral Korath's voice cut through the communication channels, frustrated and increasingly desperate. "This is not how warfare is conducted. You cannot simply ignore military reality." Sarah's response was broadcast to every ship, every station, every world that was watching. "Admiral, you're absolutely right. This isn't how warfare is conducted. This is how peace is built." The moment that changed everything came when a young voice spoke over the communication channels. It was a child aboard one of the civilian vessels that had come to watch, a human child whose family had migrated to an Imperial world decades ago. "Mama," the child asked, "why do the scary ships want to hurt the people who are being nice to each other?" The question hung in the space between fleets like a challenge to everything the galaxy had accepted as normal. Admiral Korath tried to maintain his authority, but Sarah could see something changing in his expression. "Admiral," Sarah said quietly, "you have children too, don't you?" For the first time since the communication began, the Imperial commander's voice was uncertain. That is not relevant to this situation." "It's the only thing that's relevant," Sarah replied. "Every being in your fleet, every being in ours, every being watching this broadcast, we all want the same things. We want to be safe. We want our families to thrive. We want to leave the galaxy a little better than we found it." Around the Imperial fleet, civilian ships began broadcasting their own messages. Beings who had lived under Imperial rule for generations began speaking about what they'd seen in the Alliance's demonstration. Hope, they said. They'd seen hope for the first time in their lives. Admiral Korath's fleet found itself in an impossible position. They were surrounded by civilians from their own empire, watching as beings who should have been enemies worked together in ways that made the Imperial system look primitive by comparison. The Admiral made one last attempt to assert control. All civilian vessels will withdraw immediately, or face charges of aiding enemies of the state. The response came not from Sarah or any alliance leader, but from Captain Elena Vasquez of the Merchant, ship New Harmony, a human vessel that had come from the Imperial worlds to witness the demonstration. "Admiral," Captain Vasquez said, her voice carrying across all frequencies, "we're not aiding enemies of the state. We're looking at the future of the state." The moment stretched out like a held breath, and Sarah realized that everything, not just the alliance but the entire future of galactic civilization, hung in the balance of what happened next. The silence stretched across space like a held breath. 500 Imperial warships hung motionless, surrounded by thousands of civilian vessels from across the galaxy. Every screen, every communication channel, every sensor array was focused on Admiral Korath, waiting to see if the Eternal Empire would choose to fire on its own citizens to destroy an alliance built on hope. Sarah watched the Admiral's face on the main display, seeing the struggle playing out in his expression. This was a career military officer who had built his life around following orders and maintaining Imperial authority. But he was also seeing something that challenged every assumption he'd lived by. "Admiral," Sarah said quietly, "you don't have to do this. There's another choice." "There is always another choice," came a new voice over the communication channels. It was Ambassador HFY, but he wasn't speaking from the Alliance station. He was broadcasting from the Imperial flagship itself. "Admiral Korath, I invoke Article 7 of the Imperial Charter, the right of governmental review in the face of unprecedented circumstances." The Admiral's expression shifted to shock. "Ambassador, Article 7 hasn't been invoked in over 400 years. Because we haven't faced circumstances like these in over 400 years, the ambassador replied. "Admiral, I've been observing this alliance for 3 days. I've seen species that we classified as inherently aggressive, working peacefully together. I've watched conflicts that our best diplomats couldn't resolve in decades get settled in hours through simple conversation." From her position on the Alliance station, Sarah could see the civilian ships around the Imperial fleet beginning to move, not away from the potential battle, but closer together, forming their own loose formation. They were choosing sides, and they weren't choosing the Empire. Dr. Martinez was monitoring communication channels across the gathered fleets. "Captain, I'm picking up chatter from the Imperial ships themselves. Some of their crew are questioning their orders." War Chief Scarrick stepped up beside Sarah. "My people have a saying. The warrior who refuses to examine his cause is already defeated. That admiral is examining his cause right now." Pyraxis's ancient voice rumbled through the communication system. "Admiral Korath, I have watched the rise and fall of 17 galactic empires. Each one fell when it became more important to maintain power than to serve the beings that power was meant to protect." The admiral was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could imagine the calculations running through his mind. Duty versus conscience, orders versus ethics, the empire he'd served versus the future he was witnessing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Captain Chen, if I were to, hypothetically, stand down my fleet, what assurance do I have that this alliance won't simply become another empire with better marketing?" Sarah felt the weight of the question. This was the moment that would define not just the immediate crisis, but potentially the future of galactic civilization. She thought about her choice in Pyraxis's maze, about the key that freed strangers rather than the technology that could have empowered her species. "You have the same assurance anyone has about the future." "Admiral," she said. "None at all, but you also have something better than assurance. You have agency. Join us and help us build something that's accountable to everyone, not just the powerful." "And if it fails? If this idealistic alliance collapses into chaos and war?" Sarah smiled, and somehow that smile carried across space to every being watching. "Then we'll build something better from the pieces. That's what humans do. We fail forward." The Admiral was quiet again, but this time Sarah could see something changing in his posture. When he spoke, it was to his own fleet, not to the Alliance. All Imperial vessels, this is Admiral Korath. Stand down weapons and withdraw to minimum safe distance. We are reassessing our mission parameters. The collective exhale from thousands of ships was almost audible across the communication channels. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning, not the end. Over the following weeks, the galaxy watched something unprecedented unfold. The alliance that had started with a mining captain's choice to free strangers grew into a loose confederation of worlds and species united not by conquest or treaty, but by shared principles. The Eternal Empire didn't collapse overnight. Instead, it began to transform from within. Worlds that had been client states for centuries began asserting their right to self-determination. Imperial military units started refusing orders to suppress peaceful demonstrations. Even the Imperial Council began debating reforms that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Admiral Korath, who had resigned his Imperial commission, became one of the Alliance's most effective military coordinators, not because he commanded the largest fleet, but because he understood how to protect ideals rather than territories. Ambassador HFY worked tirelessly to establish what became known as the Galactic Compact, not a government, but a framework for cooperation that any world or species could join or leave freely. War Chief Scarix discovered that his people's warrior culture translated beautifully into protecting trade routes and defending worlds that couldn't defend themselves, turning former raiders into the galaxy's most unlikely peacekeepers. Commander Veltar used her people's gravity manipulation technology to help terraform damaged worlds, turning weapons of war into tools of healing. But it was Dr. Martinez who made perhaps the most important discovery. Studying the sociological patterns of the Alliance, she identified what she called the human factor, the tendency to choose principle over pragmatism, to risk the known for the possibility of something better. It's not that humans are uniquely good, she explained in a report that became foundational to Alliance philosophy. It's that we're uniquely stubborn about certain ideas. Most species evolve past their idealism when they encounter harsh realities. Humans double down on it. 6 months after the standoff at Pyraxis's station, Sarah found herself back aboard the Terra's Pride, finally returning to Earth with the most incredible story in human history. But as they entered the Sol system, she realized that the story was far from over. Earth's orbital stations were buzzing with activity. Diplomatic vessels from dozens of species were requesting permission to establish embassies. Trade ships were arriving with technologies and resources that could transform human civilization. And everywhere, there were signs of that peculiarly human response to the impossible. They were adapting, improvising, and enthusiastically diving into the deep end of galactic civilization. "Captain," Lieutenant Torres called from his station. "We're receiving a transmission from Earth. It's unusual. Define unusual." "It's from the United Nations, but they're calling themselves the United Worlds now. They want to know if you're interested in a job." Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "What kind of job?" "They want you to head up something called the Department of Impossible Solutions. Apparently, they figure if you can accidentally reform galactic civilization, you might be useful for other problems." Sarah looked out at the blue-green world that had given birth to a species crazy enough to choose strangers over power, hope over pragmatism, and the uncertain future over the comfortable past. "Tell them I'm interested," she said, "but I'm keeping my mining license. You never know when you might need to dig up something valuable." Chief Engineer Kowski chuckled from his station. "Ma'am, I think we already did." As the Terra's Pride descended toward Earth, Sarah reflected on the journey that had started with a simple mining mission and somehow ended with the transformation of galactic civilization. The galaxy was still dangerous, still full of challenges and conflicts. But for the first time in recorded history, those conflicts were being addressed with conversation rather than conquest, with cooperation rather than domination. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was in that uniquely human way stubbornly hopeful. And sometimes, Sarah thought as Earth grew larger in the view screen, stubborn hope was exactly what the universe needed. The dragon's lair had been full of treasures, but the greatest treasure hadn't been knowledge or technology. It had been the choice to remain human in the face of impossible temptation. That choice had rippled across the galaxy, changing not just civilizations but the very idea of what civilization could be.